In May 1986, 13 students and teachers from Oregon Episcopal School began their ascent of Mount Hood. But what was meant to be a thrilling climb quickly spiraled into a nightmare. A sudden, violent storm trapped the group high on the mountain, unleashing deadly winds and blinding snow. With no shelter and temperatures plummeting, rescuers launched a desperate search. By the time they reached the climbers, 7 were dead, huddled together in a makeshift snow cave. What caused this school trip to end in tragedy, making it one of America's deadliest mountaineering disasters? Mount Hood sits tall and majestic in Oregon, part of the Cascade Range. It is a beautiful but dangerous place. Rising over 11,000 feet, its snowy slopes seem inviting, but the mountain has taken more than 120 lives in the past century. Many climbers are drawn by its beauty and the sense of accomplishment it offers. But Mount Hood is tricky. Its weather changes fast, going from clear skies to blinding snowstorms in just minutes. Avalanches, sudden falls, and hidden crevasses are real threats here. Even experienced climbers can find themselves in trouble. In fact, it's ranked among the deadliest peaks in North America. In 1981, a tragedy struck Mount Rainier, not far from Mount Hood. An avalanche there claimed 11 lives, marking the deadliest alpine accident in the continent's history. 5 years later, in 1986, Mount Hood would become the scene of another deadly disaster, one involving teenagers. It was Mother's Day in 1986, and a group of 20 people gathered at Oregon Episcopal School in Portland. They were preparing for a trip up Mount Hood, part of a program called Base Camp. This wasn't just any program. It was required for all sophomores at the school, meant to teach them survival skills and teamwork, like Outward Bound. The group included 15 students, 2 staff members, 2 mountain guides, and 1 student's mother. The group was led by Thomas Goman, the school's chaplain, a man with both mountain experience and a deep sense of responsibility toward the students. With him was Marion Horwell, the dean of students, who had never climbed a mountain before. The mood that night was hopeful and excited as they packed their gear. Some of the students felt nervous, but most were thrilled by the adventure. Tasha Amy, one of the students, stood out. Though she had limited vision in one eye, her spirit was strong. She had a reputation for never backing down from a challenge. It was the same determination that drove all 15 students to board the yellow school bus that night. By the time the group reached Timberline Lodge, located at 6,000 feet on Mount Hood's south side, it was 2:30 a.m. The wind was cold, but the weather was still manageable. The forecast was a concern. A storm was predicted, but Goman believed they could finish the climb before it hit. The guides handed out helmets, ice axes, and crampons. The team also carried compasses and long wands to mark their path through the snow. The goal was simple: summit by noon and then descend safely. Spirits were high as the group set off under the cover of darkness. As they climbed higher, the weather began to turn. It started as a light wind, but soon the snow began to fall harder. Some of the group started feeling the effects of the altitude and cold. Hillary Spray, one of the students, developed a stomach ache. Her mother, Sharon, decided it was best to turn back with her daughter. The guides assured her it was a safe choice. The remaining 18 pressed on. A few hours later, at a spot called Silcock's Hut, 2 more students, Lorcas Matana and Courtney Boatsman, decided they couldn't continue. They were feeling cramps and discomfort. They were sent back down the mountain safely with one of the guides, Dee Zaduniak, who was suffering from mild snow blindness. That left 14 climbers, 11 students, Goman, Horwell, and guide Ralph Summers, still determined to reach the summit. By mid-morning, the snow was falling heavily, and visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Summers became increasingly concerned. He told Goman they should turn back. Goman hesitated. He had faith that they could still summit and return safely. But Summers' warnings couldn't be ignored for long. Eventually, around 2 p.m., they abandoned the climb and headed back down. But by then, the storm had fully arrived. The blizzard raged with winds howling up to 100 miles per hour, strong enough to knock over even the sturdiest climber. The snow whipped across their faces, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The group tried to descend, but in the confusion, they went off course. Instead of moving directly down the mountain, they drifted sideways across its face. Summers tried to correct the course using a compass, but the group was exhausted, cold, and disoriented. At about 3:30 p.m., one of the students, Patrick McGinnis, began to struggle. He was the youngest and least insulated from the cold. He stumbled, fell, and started showing signs of hypothermia, slurred speech, unsteady steps, and a strong desire to lie down and rest. The other students gathered around him, doing what they could to keep him warm. Susan McClave, a senior who was more experienced than the others, took off her jacket and crawled into a sleeping bag with McGinnis, trying to transfer her body heat to him. It was a heroic act, but it also meant she lost crucial warmth for herself. With conditions getting worse and light fading fast, Summers made a desperate decision. He would dig a snow cave to shelter the group overnight. Digging in such extreme conditions was exhausting. The wind made every movement harder, and the snow was packed tight. But eventually, Summers and Goman managed to create a small shelter, barely enough for 6, but they squeezed in 13 people. The cramped cave quickly became damp and cold. The snow began to melt from body heat, pooling on the floor and soaking the climbers' clothing. The air was thin, and the entrance became blocked with snow. Students had to rotate shifts to clear the opening, using their hands or the one remaining ice axe. Despite their efforts, the cave was far too small to fit everyone comfortably, and the storm continued to pile snow on top of them, cutting off fresh air. By dawn on Tuesday, May 13th, it was clear that staying inside the cave was no longer an option. Summers and one of the students, Molly Shula, volunteered to head down for help. The plan was risky. They had no clear sense of direction, and the storm was still intense. But there was no other choice. They left the group behind, promising to return with rescuers. Inside the cave, the remaining climbers tried to stay hopeful, but they were already showing signs of severe hypothermia, uncontrollable shivering, confusion, and loss of coordination. 3 students, Allison Litzenberger, Aaron O'Leary, and Eric Sandvik, decided to make their own attempt to escape the cave. Litzenberger was the first to leave, trying to force her way through the snow-packed entrance. O'Leary and Sandvik followed shortly after, and they were soon lost in the whiteout. The snow relentlessly piled up over the next hours, completely sealing the cave's entrance. The remaining climbers were now buried under several feet of snow. Meanwhile, Summers and Shula continued their treacherous descent. Visibility was almost non-existent, and they ended up off course. But, by some stroke of luck, they stumbled upon Mount Hood Meadows, a ski resort east of Timberline Lodge. They managed to find help, but the rescue effort would be slow to launch due to the ongoing storm. The trapped climbers, however, could only wait, praying for a miracle that the rescuers would arrive before it was too late. Back at Timberline Lodge, news of the overdue group had already raised concerns late Monday night, sparking calls to rescue teams. By early Tuesday morning, around 5 a.m., the Portland Mountain Rescue Team had mobilized at the base of Mount Hood, ready to go, despite the storm. But the conditions were worse than they could have imagined. Winds were whipping at over 100 miles per hour, heavy snow blocked visibility to only a few feet, and even sturdy snowcats were overturned by the fierce gusts. The rescuers knew that searching the mountain in such conditions would be dangerous, but time was running out. Despite these challenges, rescuers pressed on. The weather was a major obstacle. Helicopters couldn't fly due to zero visibility, so ground teams moved cautiously, inch by inch, hoping to find any sign of the missing climbers. But there was one major problem. They didn't know the exact location of the snow cave. They knew that the climbers had veered off course, but where exactly they were trapped remained unclear. Every minute felt critical. They were racing against time and the cold. By Wednesday morning, searchers found the bodies of the 3 students who had tried to leave the cave: Allison Litzenberger, Aaron O'Leary, and Eric Sandvik. The storm had beaten them down before they could reach help. It was a heartbreaking discovery for the rescue teams. With heavy hearts, they continued their search, still hopeful that others were alive. Meanwhile, back at the snow cave, the remaining climbers were fighting to survive. As the snow piled up, the air inside the cave grew thinner. The cold was relentless, causing deep shivers and confusion among the group. Brenton Clark and Giles Thompson were among those still hanging on. They had used every bit of energy they had to keep moving and breathing, but their bodies were weakening fast. Later that afternoon, there was finally a breakthrough. Master Sergeant Richard Harder, part of an Air Force rescue team, flew over the mountain in a helicopter. He thought the search teams were looking too high up. He decided to try a different spot, lower down, where he believed the snow cave might be. To mark this spot, he dropped a flare, hoping the searchers on the ground would check it out. Some rescuers were unsure about moving, but Harder insisted. They began searching in the new area, using long poles to poke through the snow. Then, around 5:30 p.m. on Wednesday, one of the rescuers, Charlie Eck, felt his pole hit something hard. It was a solid surface beneath the snow. The team quickly started digging, working as fast as they could. Just a few minutes later, they uncovered the entrance to the snow cave. Inside, 2 survivors were found, Brenton Clark and Giles Thompson. Clark was semi-conscious, shivering, and barely able to speak. Thompson, though very weak, was still able to mutter faint words. The rescuers worked quickly to pull them out and carry them to the waiting helicopters. Both survivors were severely hypothermic, meaning their body temperatures had dropped dangerously low. Medics wrapped them in warm blankets and rushed them to nearby hospitals. Sadly, the rescue team also discovered the bodies of the others who hadn't made it. Each had fought bravely, but the freezing temperatures and lack of air were too much. The rescue effort was over, but it had left a deep scar on everyone involved. The aftermath of the disaster was hard to process. For the survivors, recovery was long and painful. Both Brenton and Giles lost their legs due to severe frostbite, which is a condition where skin and tissues freeze. Doctors tried everything to save their limbs, but the damage was too severe. Brenton later said, "I didn't think I was going to make it, but I'm grateful to be alive." Giles too had a strong spirit, saying, "We tried our best. I think about the others every day." The parents of the students who died faced unimaginable grief, but many also felt a deep sense of anger and frustration. They wanted answers. Why was the trip allowed to proceed, especially given the storm warnings? How could trusted leaders and guides have taken such risks with the students' lives? The school, Oregon Episcopal, found itself at the center of harsh scrutiny, facing questions from grieving families, the community, and the media. This wasn't just an accident. It became a lightning rod for criticism of leadership, planning, and safety. In response, Oregon Episcopal School conducted an internal investigation to examine what went wrong. The findings showed that, while the storm's severity may have surprised some, there were key moments when decisions could have been made differently. The trip leaders had gambled on the idea that the climb could be completed before the worst of the weather struck, a decision that would prove fatal. The conclusions highlighted that critical judgment calls were delayed and that the guides underestimated the speed at which conditions would deteriorate. Grief over the tragedy gave way to legal action. Families of 7 students who died were offered settlements by the school's insurer. But one family, the McGinnises, chose to file a wrongful death lawsuit. Their case underscored questions about the school's responsibility, alleging that the climb had been reckless given the known risks. In a powerful affidavit, Oregon Episcopal's board chairman asked for the trial to be postponed until after the upcoming graduation, hoping to spare surviving students additional trauma. The judge agreed, and in June 1988, just before trial proceedings were set to begin, a settlement was reached with most families. But not everyone felt that justice had been served. Richard Hayter Sr., who had lost his son in the disaster, remained a vocal critic of the base camp program. He called it a death march and demanded that those responsible be held accountable for what he saw as reckless behavior. Hayter and his wife, Judith, sought $2.76 million in damages, citing the school's negligence and the guide's risky decisions. The trial itself was emotional, with the Hayters describing their loss and the school defending its decisions. In the end, the jury did not find the guides liable, but ruled that the school had been negligent, awarding the Hayters $500,000, a fraction of what they sought, but a powerful judgment that cast a lasting shadow over the program. Following the tragedy and legal battles, Oregon Episcopal School made sweeping changes to the base camp program. Climbing Mount Hood was no longer required. The school shifted its outdoor programs to focus on safer, lower-altitude activities that still taught resilience and teamwork, but without extreme risks. Lessons from the investigation pushed the school to implement stricter safety protocols and procedures that would prevent such a tragedy from repeating. Climbing experts were also brought in to help redesign protocols, especially when it came to making swift, cautious decisions in changing weather. One guide captured this lesson plainly. If the mountain says no, you listen. A major part of this new approach was establishing better communication strategies. In the chaos of the storm, the climbers' radios had failed, and there was no backup. Today, rescue teams on Mount Hood are equipped with modern tools, like GPS devices and satellite phones, to ensure that they stay connected, even in extreme weather. Every year since the disaster, the school holds a memorial service to honor the 9 climbers who lost their lives. Students, families, and faculty gather to reflect on the lessons and on what they have done to keep others safe. "We remember not just what happened," a teacher once said, "but what we've done to make sure it doesn't happen again." This annual event serves as a time to mourn, but also a reminder of how important it is to learn from the past and to honor those lost by being better prepared. In the end, the Mount Hood disaster of 1986 remains a story of courage, mistakes, and survival. And while the scars will never fully heal, the lessons learned have saved lives since.